Traffic congestion, constant noise and ever-increasing levels of air pollution are the unfortunate facts of life in all of Britain's major cities. The automobile, once regarded as the principal instrument of progress and prosperity, is slowly strangling our urban centres. For many cities, the situation is now critical. Traditional methods of traffic control are being constantly augmented by a bewildering variety of novel ideas and stopgap solutions. Inner city ring roads, one-way systems and urban clearways are now common. Bus and cycle lanes, the latter often constructed at some cost, indicate a growing determination by local authorities to reduce the volume of traffic on the roads. The much maligned traffic warden, without whom inner city chaos would be so bad that parking at all would be virtually impossible, has now been joined by a far more efficient predator. The physical removal of illegally parked cars is a personal and financial trauma for thousands of motorists every year. Mounting problems breed desperate solutions, and as car ownership continues to grow, scenes like these are set to become more familiar in a growing number of our towns and cities. Of course, not everyone is equally at fault. Many of us choose public transport, the train to get us quickly into town, and then buses or taxis to get around. But neither the bus nor the taxi address the central problem of urban congestion. Both have to jostle for space, choking rather than easing the flow of traffic. One solution, being pioneered in Manchester, is the resurrection of a form of transport not seen in Britain's cities for decades. The tram, in its modern format, re-entered service in Manchester in April 1992, after an absence of more than 40 years. The renaissance of the tram is perhaps the most remarkable of the many innovations that have transformed urban transport systems in the past few years. Despite its undeniable advantages of efficiency, cleanliness and convenience, the tram has long been regarded as obsolete, a distant memory from a bygone era. Yet the success of the Manchester Supertram and the prospect of other cities following in Manchester's footsteps promises a renewal of interest not just in the tram, but in the golden age of urban transport, epitomized so vividly in the trams of yesteryear. At the National Tramways Museum at Crich in Derbyshire, the history of the tram is kept alive. Over 100,000 visitors every year testify to its continuing popularity. Nostalgia inevitably draws many. The broad range of exhibits evokes memories of tramway journeys in virtually all of Britain's major cities. For others, too young to have anything more than a historical appreciation, the appeal lies perhaps in the timeless simplicity of the vehicle's design. Over the years, the basic principles of tramcar operation have changed very little. The first street tramway in Britain was launched in 1860 by George Francis Train. Train's Birkenhead horse tram sat an astonishing 48 passengers on 2 decks, virtually double the capacity of existing horse bus designs. Although Train's early ventures proved unsuccessful, the clear superiority of the tram over the bus was evident in its comparatively greater efficiency and the higher standards of passenger comfort. During the 1870s, tramway systems were introduced to most of Britain's towns and cities. By the end of the decade, over 200 miles of tram lines had been laid. While double-deck trams of the period were largely based on existing horse-bus designs, single-deck trams more closely resembled contemporary railway carriages and evoked the comparatively greater comfort and luxury of railway transport. This single-deck tram, seen here at the National Tramways Museum, entered service in Sheffield in 1875 and is a typical example of the style and methods of construction then prevalent. Built of wood and double-ended, it ran on simple cast-iron wheels. The brakes were metal blocks and were applied by turning a wheel or handle mounted on both driving platforms. The interior had benches on either side of a central gangway, and sliding or sash windows were standard in both single and double-deck varieties. Early double-deck tramcars featured a knife-board seating arrangement on the upper deck. Common also to horse buses of the period, the knife-board was a double bench running along the length of the roof. Later horse trams had rows of transverse benches on the upper deck. The seat backs were designed to be reversible so that passengers could always sit facing the direction of travel. The horse tram owed its success to a number of factors, not least the reduced rolling resistance of iron wheels on smooth rails. But the key to success was the development of an acceptable form of recessed rail. Train's early ventures were hamstrung by his use of the American-style step rail. This was a steel plate with a raised outside edge, standing 3/4 of an inch above the level of the road. The raised edge, though suitable for trams, presented a hazard to other traffic. One attempt at solving the problem was the 1861 Salford perambulatory tramline. In this configuration, 2 load-bearing plates were laid level with the surface of the road. The third, centre plate, had a groove designed to take a guide wheel attached to the front of the tramcar. A better and more enduring solution came with the arrival of the shallow-grooved girder rail. This enabled the load-bearing part of the rail to be laid level with the street, while a side groove accommodated a projecting flange on the tram wheel. Having solved this problem, tramline operators soon turned their attention to the development of alternative forms of traction. Steam power was the obvious first choice, and various different types of steam-powered tram were developed, but the most common arrangement was the separate locomotive and trailer. The principal advantage of steam over horse traction was the higher passenger capacities provided by larger vehicles and their ability to negotiate steeply graded routes. At its peak, in the last decade of the century, steam traction was employed on 50 British tramway systems, powering some 500 trams. Another method of overcoming the problems of steep gradients was the use of cable traction. Cable operation was an ingenious application of steam power, in which stationary steam engines hauled trams by means of underground cables. These constantly moving cables ran in conduits placed beneath the surface of the road. The cable was accessed through a slot running between the tram rails. To attach and detach themselves, the trams used a device known as a grip. This allowed them to stop and start, and to manoeuvre seemingly independently of the cable. The first cable tramway in Britain was the Highgate Hill Line in London, opened on May the 29th, 1884. A second London line ran up and down Brixton Hill, but it was in Edinburgh that cable was most extensively employed. Opened in 1888, the Edinburgh cable system grew to become the fourth largest in the world. At its height in the early 1900s, Edinburgh had 205 double-deck cable tramcars operating on 25 miles of track. Edinburgh's investment in cable operation committed the city to this form of traction long after it had been rendered obsolete by the development of electric traction. With the exception of Edinburgh, the electrification of Britain's tramway systems was virtually complete by the second decade of the 20th century. Electric traction was to prove ideally suited to tramcar operation. The dynamo generator developed during the 1870s enabled bulk supplies of electricity to be made widely available for the first time. In the dynamo, electricity is produced by spinning one or more coils of wire in a magnetic field. The process also has a reverse application. If electricity is fed through the coils, the apparatus will spin in the magnetic field. This is the principle of the electric motor. Normally situated under the floor of the car, the electric motor not only drove the car but was also able to act as a brake. Operated simply by the driver's current controller mechanism, the electric motor supplied the tram with the most lightweight and efficient form of traction possible. Electrification provided the tram with a further attraction, one not available to cable systems. Electric lighting, interior and exterior, was a standard feature of all electric trams. It is perhaps difficult for us to imagine the impact this had on Victorian Britain. At a time when few people had electricity in their homes, the electric tramcar must have seemed a miracle of science and technology. Sailing serenely through the city streets, these illuminated glass palaces conferred an aura of glamour to public transport that will probably never be seen again. The comparatively slow process of electrification was a result not of any major engineering deficiencies, but of small technical difficulties in the methods of current collection. The first electric street tramway in Britain opened in Blackpool in 1885. Electric power was supplied via two conducting rails laid in a conduit under the surface of the road. As in the Edinburgh cable system, the conduit was accessed through a slot between the rails. The tram's conducting apparatus, known as a plough, fed the current to the electric motor. Another method employed an extra rail located either at the side of or between the tram rails. Power was fed through the rail and thence to the tram by means of a trailing conductor rod. The live rail was cheap, reliable, but potentially lethal, and never progressed beyond experimental operation. An ingenious method, used most notably in London, Lincoln and Wolverhampton, was the surface contact system. A closed conduit set in the roadway carried the power cable. Contact studs were operated automatically by the passage of the tram, creating a circuit and conducting electricity from the cable only when the tram was overhead. The obvious and most economical method, the overhead wire, suffered initially from two drawbacks. The first was an understandable public and municipal distaste for the often unsightly networks of wire. The second was a succession of early design failures in the method of power collection. The problem was finally solved in the last decade of the century with the development of the spring-mounted swivelling trolley pole. This used a conductor wheel running under the wire and held in contact by a powerful spring. This system was introduced first in Leeds and then in most of Britain's cities. A later improvement on this design was the bow collector. Also spring-mounted, it had a more reliable contact with the overhead wire and could automatically adjust to the trailing position when the car reversed for the return journey. The pace of electrification quickened considerably in the first decade of the 20th century. By 1904, there were more than 6,000 electric trams in Britain, and by 1910, more than 11,000, running on 2,500 miles of track. From their introduction, electric trams further accelerated a process that had begun with the expansion of horse and railway transport in the mid-19th century. Improvements in services, coupled with lower fares, encouraged a shift in population from the inner cities to the suburbs. This process was mirrored by a simultaneous growth in the city centre retail and entertainment industries. Better and more reliable transport enabled significant numbers of ordinary people for the first time to commute in and out of the cities for work, shopping and leisure. In the first decades of the 20th century, as the boom in public transport began to transform the urban landscape in Britain, it was the tram car which emerged as the principal means of passenger transport in our towns and cities. The golden age of the tram began in the last years of the 19th century and was to last, with a few notable exceptions, well into the 1930s. Perhaps the tram cars which best encapsulate this heyday of public transport are the famous and long-lived Glasgow trams. Glasgow Corporation tramcar number 812 arrived at Crich in 1960 after a prodigious 60 years of public service. Entering service in 1900 as an uncanopied open topper, number 812 10 years later acquired a top cover and, a few years after that, platform vestibules. During its long working life, number 812 was substantially overhauled and renovated numerous times, covering more than 3 million miles in a service career that very nearly spans the entire history of British electric tramcar operation. Horse tram operations were taken over by Glasgow Corporation in 1894, and the first electric services introduced in 1898. In the first decade of the 20th century, tramcar operations expanded rapidly, and by 1914, there were 851 electric trams operating on nearly 200 miles of track. Amongst the most famous of the many designs of tramcars were the Glasgow Standard cars. More than 1,000 of these were built over a 30-year period and in 4 distinct phases of development. Car number 22 was one of the last to be built with open balconies and vestibuled platforms and entered service in 1922. The Brill 21E four-wheeled truck was a standard feature of the Glasgow fleet, and the car was powered by two 323-volt British Westinghouse motors, producing 45 horsepower and a top speed of nearly 30 miles per hour. Car number 22 was withdrawn from service in 1960 and sent to Crich for preservation in 1963. Another fine example of the standard British tram car of the period is car number 60. One of the museum's prized exhibits, car number 60 never actually saw commercial service in Britain, having been exported to South Africa in 1906, soon after it was completed. Built by the United Electric Car Company of Preston, it is powered by two Westinghouse motors housed in a Brill 21E truck and features the traditional open balconies and platforms that were to prove ideally suited to the South African climate. Withdrawn from service in 1960 and shipped back to Britain for preservation, car number 60 represents an era when British tram cars were exported all over the world. Car number 1282 represents the last stage in the evolution of Glasgow's tramcars. Introduced in 1937, the Coronation class tramcars featured two four-wheeled bogie cars swivelling independently under the tram. This ensured a smoother and more comfortable ride. The new cars, as they were known in Glasgow throughout the remaining years of tramway operation, incorporated a significant number of design improvements over their predecessors. Built in the modern, streamlined style, they were fast, comfortable, well lit, and mechanically ventilated. And to guard against drafts, folding doors were fitted as standard. Production of the Coronation class ceased in 1940, and car number 1282 was one of the very last to be built. It was also one of the very last trams to run in Glasgow, ending its service career on September the 4th, 1962, in the formal procession to mark the closing of the Great Glasgow System. With more than 1,100 trams operating on some 200 miles of track, Glasgow's tramcar system at its peak was second only to London in size. The early expansion was assisted by a number of valuable acquisitions. Car number 68 was originally built for the independent Paisley District tramways and passed into Glasgow's possession when the Paisley system was acquired by Glasgow in 1923. With an open upper deck and entrance platforms, car number 68 is a rare example of early tramcar design and closely resembles what its stablemate, number 812, must have looked like before the addition of the top cover and platform vestibules. In service for a total of 34 years, car number 68 represents a significant chapter in the growth and development of Glasgow's tramway system. In the heyday of Britain's tramcar industry, the familiar standard car permitted of a great number of variations. Those standard cars, designed and built by commercial manufacturers, had to be built according to the local specifications of each municipality. While larger cities, such as London and Glasgow, built their own cars to their own specifications and in their own workshops. Although not geared to large-scale manufacture of individual components, many of the larger workshops had extensive facilities, allowing them to cast new parts as replacements for worn or damaged ones. Repair and maintenance, though important and a major part of the workshop's task, was, however, subsidiary to its principal function, that of assembling and finishing the vehicles themselves. The standard early tramcar was constructed largely of wood. The basic framework was typically oak, with timber flooring and panelling. Later models used more sophisticated methods. Steel reinforcements to the underframe quickly evolved into the all-steel frame, and wooden panelling was replaced with metal. When fully assembled and glazed, the completed tram would be painted in the distinctive livery of the city or town it was destined to serve. The completed tramcar was, however, only part of the equation. The tramway system was, by the 1920s, everywhere powered by electricity, and the favoured method of distribution was by overhead wire. From the generating station, current was supplied initially by underground cable, and then relayed to the networks of wire by means of local junction boxes. Power failures could be catastrophic, crippling an entire system, and consequently the tramway operators were careful to ensure constant maintenance and a rapid response to any interruptions in the power supply. The third factor in the equation was, of course, the running track itself. When the original tracks had been laid in the late 19th century, they had proved a remarkably smooth contrast to the pitted and potholed surface of Victorian streets. The uniform surface, coupled with reduced rolling resistance of metal wheels on metal rails, had allowed the tram to provide a faster, smoother and more comfortable service than its immediate competitor, the horse bus, literally laying the basis for the horse tram's runaway success. Track laying, like the design of the rails themselves, had benefited from a gradual process of technical refinement, and in the era of the electric tram had reached a high degree of efficiency and expertise. In wide trenches, a gravel mix provided the correct depth and a firm foundation for the sleepers. The lengths of rail which were laid along the sleepers were welded together using equipment and procedures which, though adequate to the task, would be unlikely to satisfy today's somewhat more stringent health and safety requirements. Metal yokes ensured that the rails were held firmly and uniformly at the correct width. The standard British gauge being 4 foot 8.5 inches. A layer of concrete mix securely embedded the sleepers and also gave an even base for the fitting of granite sets, which brought the road surface level with the grooved rails. When the sets were fixed, by pouring tar between them and spreading a final cement mix on top, the completed tram track was ready for operation. Throughout Britain's towns and cities, this standard tram track conveyed different types of trams in their distinctive liveries across a huge variety of systems. This was the golden age of public transport, of which the tramcar, as the flagship of municipal operations, remains the most poignant reminder. Today at Crich, the surviving representatives of these systems can be seen running on the same rails. Amongst the many vehicles in the museum's collection, car number 45 occupies a prominent place in the history of tramcar preservation. Built by Hurst and Nelson of Motherwell to similar design specifications as car number 68, number 45 entered service with Southampton Corporation tramways soon after the system was electrified in 1900. The Southampton system was one of the first to be dismantled, the victim of post-war economies and the competition from bus and trolleybus manufacturers. And car number 45 was withdrawn from service shortly before tramcar operation ended in 1949. Car number 45 is unique in being the only working tramcar in the museum's collection to feature the traditional knife-board seating arrangement on the upper deck. It is also unique in being the first electric tramcar in Britain to be purchased for preservation, and as such, laid the foundations for the entire collection. Another early casualty of post-war rationalisation was the once thriving Newcastle tramway system. Car number 102, one of the many built by Hurst and Nelson, was one of the first electric tramcars to operate in Newcastle. Entering service in 1901 as an open-sided single-decker, number 102 was later substantially modified with the addition of side panels, stairwells and an upper deck. Withdrawn in 1949, shortly before the closure of the Newcastle system, car number 102 has since returned to the city twice. The first time for reconstruction work, and then in 1989 to operate at the Gateshead Garden Festival. The closure of the Southampton and Newcastle tramway systems represented a serious blow to hopes of the tram's survival in Britain. But it was to be the closure of the massive London system that would ultimately signal the death knell for the tram. Although by no means the first to electrify, and amongst the last to rationalise, the sheer size of the London system guaranteed its preeminence amongst Britain's transport operators. At its peak in the early 30s, the capital had more than 2,500 trams, but much of its route mileage was served by the largely dated conduit collection method of power supply. Even on those routes served by overhead wires, the tram faced increasing competition from a vehicle that would eventually replace it completely on many services. The trolleybus was essentially a hybrid vehicle. It was powered, like the tram, by an electric motor and drew its current from the system of overhead wires designed to serve the tram. But its rubber tyres obviated the need for track replacement, and on routes where the trolleybus became established, tram tracks soon fell into disrepair. From their introduction in 1931, London's trolleybuses were increasingly seen as the natural successors to the trams, and by 1939, both their numbers and their route mileage were greater than those of the trams. Indeed, London's commitment to tramcar operation was never wholehearted, and the introduction of services was often belated and badly handled. The tram never achieved the ascendancy in London that it was to enjoy in every other major city. Yet despite the comparative sparsity of provision and the lack of municipal support, the London tramcar system remained popular and profitable for most of its life. The London standard car, the E1, was built in greater numbers than any other British tramcar, and with its stablemate, the E3, dominated the London fleet. E-class trams benefited from an extensive programme of maintenance and renovation, surviving in considerable numbers right up until the closure of the system in July 1952. A class of streamlined trams known as Felthams were also produced, but not in sufficient numbers to challenge the dominance of the E-class. And by the time the system closed, they had all been withdrawn. Many sold to still surviving provincial systems such as Leeds or Glasgow. Although many of these systems continued to operate long after the demise of the London system, fewer and fewer new trams were constructed after the late 40s. Surviving fleets were augmented by buying surplus trams from contracting or closing systems. These trams were normally repainted in new liveries, but retained the distinctive design features of their original fleets. With an acute shortage of new trams, provincial operators were compelled to rely on extending the lives of their existing vehicles. As well as the routine tasks of maintenance and repair, the workshops often had to undertake more extensive overhauls, restoring and renovating trams that might otherwise have been withdrawn. But no amount of maintenance and renovation could prolong indefinitely the lives of systems already in decline. Cannibalization of aging trams for spare parts became endemic, and track repairs became increasingly makeshift and temporary. The 1950s were the twilight years of tramcar operation in Britain, when contraction was the norm and partial closures merely the symptoms of irreversible decline. By the mid-1950s, total abandonment had become the official policy of virtually every surviving municipal operator. And as the decade drew to a close, the fleets dwindled as more and more cars made their final runs to the depot. Their last journey, however, was often not made under their own power. Vast numbers of tramcars were sold for scrap, taken out of the depot, and towed or transported on specially adapted vehicles to their final destination. Some, though, were saved from the breaker's yard in a growing recognition of the tram's importance, both to the history of transport and within the broader history of Britain's cities. Edinburgh car number 35 was one of those selected for preservation. After extensive renovation and repainting, it was displayed in Edinburgh Transport's own museum before joining the other exhibits at Crich. Perhaps more than any other, Liverpool Corporation car number 869 illustrates the gradual process of decline which characterized provincial tramcar operations in the 1950s. Number 869 entered service in June 1936, but in the years following World War II suffered, like the system itself, from an official policy of municipal neglect. Tramline closures in the 40s and 50s proceeded at such a pace that Liverpool found itself with a surplus of modern vehicles. Number 869 was one of a batch of liners with a similar specification to the Glasgow Coronation class, and in 1954, the car was purchased by the Glasgow Corporation. Renumbered and painted in the familiar Glasgow livery, number 869 saw a further 6 years of service before being acquired for preservation and restored to its original green and cream city colours. Leeds Corporation tramways, the second last of the major English systems to close, is represented at Crich by two cars. Car number 399, in its original chocolate, primrose and white livery, entered service in 1925. Built to a traditional design, number 399 was fitted with air track brakes to enable it to operate on steeply graded routes. The car was withdrawn in 1959 as part of an ongoing program of tram replacement with surplus cars from other systems. After service as a depot shunter, number 399 was gradually cannibalized for spare parts, arriving at Crich partially stripped. Painstakingly reconstructed over a long period, the car re-entered service only at the very end of the 1990 season. Car number 180 represents the most successful class of trams ever to run in Leeds. The Horsefields, or showboats as they were popularly known, came into service in the early 1930s. Although conservative in appearance, the class was notable for a number of features. With composite bodywork, red leather upholstery and a highly sophisticated braking system, these trams proved both popular and reliable. Car number 180 was actually withdrawn in 1957, but returned to service soon after and ran in the formal closing procession of Leeds Corporation Tramways on November the 7th, 1959. Sheffield car number 510 was the last urban tram car to run in England. Opening in September 1899, the Sheffield system was amongst the first of the major municipal systems to be electrified. By 1904, there were 241 electric trams in service, and tramcar construction remained a flourishing local industry into the second half of the century. Car number 510 entered service in 1950, sadly one of the last of the new trams to be built. In 1952, Sheffield City Council took the decision to run down its existing tramway operations, and construction of new trams came to an end. For the formal closing procession on October the 8th, 1960, number 510 was lavishly repainted in commemorative livery, in which condition it has since been preserved. Commemorative trams were increasingly seen in Britain's towns and cities as, one by one, the few remaining tramcar systems were wound down. But these displays often disguised a determined municipal resolve to usher in new transport strategies and services. In such a climate of change and renewal, it was perhaps inevitable that the last closures would be marked by a process of accelerated withdrawals. Still profitable routes were closed as eagerly as the most uneconomic. The tram, though it had friends, had few supporters. The voluble private car lobby regarded the tram as a nuisance, an obstacle to the free flow of traffic, and the single biggest contributory factor to inner city congestion. Though many of the tram's detractors were advancing their own interests, and despite the dubious validity of many of their arguments, they effectively succeeded in portraying the tram as hopelessly obsolete, a quaint relic of a bygone age. Municipal transport strategies everywhere regarded the bus as the modern, flexible and economic alternative, and one by one, the last great systems were dismantled and scrapped. little time was wasted in obliterating all trace of the tram's existence. Rails were torn up and the roads resurfaced, though some still bear the scars of track removal to this day. As the last systems approached the end, last tram weeks were usually organised to publicly mark the passing of the tram, and large numbers of people of all ages flocked to make their farewell journeys. In closing night ceremonies in cities up and down the country, commemorative trams were bedecked with lights, transforming them into marvellously illuminated spectacles. For many of their passengers and those lining the streets, the scenes must have evoked memories of an almost forgotten era, when the first electric trams sailed magically out of the Victorian gloom, the brilliant heralds of a brave new world. On their final runs, the commemorative trams flared through the city streets in one last magnificent light show, the culminating spectacle of more than half a century of service. Yet there was one British town where the tram lights blazed as brightly as ever, and which obstinately refused to allow the tram to become entirely a nostalgic memory or a museum exhibit. Blackpool was the first town in Britain to have an electric tram line when the original promenade line opened in 1885. And when Glasgow's trams stopped running in 1962, Blackpool became the last bastion of the tramcar in Britain. Doubtless, part of the appeal of the Blackpool trams over the last 30 years has been nostalgia. But even in the golden age of British tramway systems, the Blackpool trams were one of the resort's principal attractions. The novelty value of the first electric conduit trams drew crowds as large as any today. After the change to overhead wires in 1899, the original line became part of a rapidly expanding system, which continued to expand in size over the next 3 decades. And when trams and tram systems elsewhere were in retreat from the advance of the bus, the numbers of passengers using Blackpool's trams continued to rise, reaching an all-time high of 58 million passengers carried in 1950. Blackpool also gained an early reputation for distinctive tramcar design. Innovations such as twin staircases and open sides are particularly associated with Blackpool. The famous single-deck toast rack, seen here at Crich, is an example of Blackpool's uniquely innovatory flair. Number 166 is one of several Blackpool trams at Crich and is the sole survivor of a fleet of 30 toast rack cars introduced in 1911 as Blackpool's answer to the motor charabanc. Obviously fine weather cars, they operated a circular tour and a promenade service until they were withdrawn in 1939. Car number 167 is another example of the innovatory style that characterized Blackpool's trams. Intended for high-speed running, the class was distinguished by the centrally mounted tower, which originally supported a diamond-shaped pantograph current collector. Even after the pantograph was replaced by a trolley pole, these trams remained known as pantograph cars. Blackpool also produced its own version of the British standard car, of which car number 40 is a unique example. Part of a batch of 42 cars built in the 1920s, number 40 was originally built without platform vestibules. These were added later as part of a programme of modernisation, which was also to include interior refurbishment and enclosure of the upper balconies. Number 40, however, was not fully modified and became the last open balconied tramcar to operate in Britain. The expansion and modernisation of Blackpool's tramway system continued in the 1930s with the introduction of a class of luxury cars. The Blackpool Streamliners, in both single and double-deck variants, were characterised by their sleek lines, high operating speeds, and the adoption of the unusual centre entrance for loading and unloading passengers. The high specification of the Streamliner and the comparative longevity of the tramcar in general is attested by the fact that even today, nearly 60 years after their introduction, significant numbers of Streamliners are still running in Blackpool. Although Blackpool's tramway system has contracted over the years, it still remains a popular and profitable service. In the late 1980s, Blackpool demonstrated its continuing faith in the tramcar with the introduction of an entirely new class of vehicle. The Centenary class represents the latest version of the Blackpool tram. Past examples of Blackpool's trams in all their variety continue to operate alongside the newest of their breed. But the Centenary class tram not only provides a link between the past and the present of tramcar operation in Blackpool, it also points towards the future of the tram in Britain. As more and more cities like Manchester rediscover the advantages and environmental benefits of inner-city tram lines, a new and more enduring golden age may now be dawning for the British tramcar.